We are pleased to offer this session with support from the Climate AgriSolutions Fund, which is delivered by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And that's through the Agricultural Climate Solutions On-Farm Climate Action Fund. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that this session is taking place across many unceded and sovereign Indigenous territories, and I'm joining you from the Statliam Nation territories. I invite you all to reflect on the different lands that you're on as well. Uh, as you just saw, this session is being recorded. If there's anyone who does eventually, who doesn't want to be recorded and distributed and does participate in the chat, in discussions, just let me know in the chat and we'll make sure that we edit you out. I'm going to launch a poll is what I'm going to do. There's only, I think, about 4 or 5 questions, and it's just going to give us a little bit of a sense of what kind of producer you are, your grazing practices and your relationship to weeds, and sort of location as well. So let me just get that going. If you can all just take a moment to fill that out, that would be great. And then I'll just keep talking while you guys are doing that. So basically the format for today is that we're going to, we'll begin with our main presenter, Sarah Flack, who I'll introduce in a moment. But after her presentation, we'll move on to a question and answer round. So we'll manage that. So you can either put questions in the chat while she's speaking. If you do that, can you just put the word question in front of it so we can filter out which ones are questions and which are just comments? But then also we'll be managing like raised hands during the question and answer session, so you can do either or. So in that question and answer round, we also have BC agrologist Greg Teagat on hand. Sarah Flack is from the East and is very knowledgeable, but then Greg is available to answer questions that are BC specific. And after that, we'll roll into some brief presentations from 3 different producers around the province in different areas who are raising different livestock and have had different experiences with targeted grazing on weeds. And then after that, we're going to welcome Torrin Kelly from the BC Invasive Species Council to discuss their 3-year goat grazing project. And that again will be followed by a question and answer discussion. I think that's about it. I think we'll get started. I'll introduce Sarah and then I'll hand it over to her. Let me just turn this poll off here. So Sarah is a grazing expert and author of a couple of books, but the one that I'm going to mention here is The Art and Science of Grazing, among other books. She has 30 years of experience working with grass-based farmers on business planning combined with agronomy to improve forages, soils, and pastures. She also teaches workshops and has written articles and other publications with the goal to create more successful grass-based livestock farms to empower farmers and create positive changes for pastures, soils, livestock, farm finances, and most of all, farmers' quality of life, which is very important. Okay, Sarah, I'm going to hand it over to you. I'm just going to put the spotlight on you, and then you can share your screen.
Great. All right, let me see if I can put that into slide mode. There it goes. All right. Well, thank you for inviting me. I always enjoy, I live in Vermont, and so I'm about 20 minutes from the Canadian border. So whenever I'm going out to eat or going skiing somewhere other than in the woods behind my house, it's usually in Canada. Though just over the border here is Quebec. And so definitely other side of the continent from you guys. But really appreciate being invited to talk with you about this. This is one of my favorite subjects. And I'm going to approach it the way I approach it when I'm invited to go to a place where I don't live and I'm not seeing and meeting the plants on a daily basis. So I've done grazing consulting and agronomy consulting and business planning with farmers all over North America and also a little bit on random Caribbean islands and a little bit in Europe. And so I'm frequently encountering weeds that go by whatever name that the locals use, and having to figure out like, what is this weed and is it really a weed? And how do we prevent it? How do we make it not spread as much? How do we eliminate it? or how do we shift our thinking and say, oh, this one actually in this context is a forage, not a weed. Um, so I'm going to kind of walk you through my thinking process of how I approach figuring out if it's a weed, and if it is a weed, what do we do about it? All right. Just adjusting my screen so I can see my own slides. Um, and Actually, the quiz just popped up, and it looks like we've got a pretty good mix. Lots of beef producers, some sheep producers, a little bit of poultry, a bunch of mixed species, um, and folks using portable electric fencing and permanent fencing. About half are doing rotational grazing. 25% are just getting started. And the winning weeds are Canada thistle and knapweed. I'll be talking about both of those. Oh, and creeping buttercup, another one of my favorites. And then there's a bunch of others. And when we get to that point where we're talking about different weed species, we can also get into the details on them. So I wanted to just start out. This is a slide showing a herd of grass-fed dairy cows in New York State eating burdocks in the vegetative stage. And that's typically something that we think of as a weed, but on some farms it is eaten. It doesn't have fantastic digestibility, so I don't generally recommend it as part of the dairy ration. But it was really interesting to observe how happily the cows were selectively eating the burdock before they ate anything else in that pasture that day. And then the other photograph in here is tall fescue, which is typically thought of as a forage, but in many farms where you are able to grow more palatable cool season perennial grasses, some of the tall fescues can actually be considered a weed. So it really is very context specific as to whether it's a weed or a forage on an individual farm and within a specific climate zone. The exception to that is when we're dealing with something that's acutely toxic. These are two of the plants that I have identified as causing death or severe illness in livestock. The ones with the sheep, and that's actually my farm and my toxic plants. I don't always like to pick on other farmers with my slides. That is false hellebore, and it is grows in abundance on my farm, and none of the livestock on my farm have ever died from it because they seem to have learned not to eat it. But I have worked with farms where the animals have eaten that when they're new animals introduced to a pasture, or if the pasture is overgrown and they're running out of other things to eat. And then the other one with the little white berries on it is white baneberry that I've seen cause some fatalities too. So there is a pretty wide range. This is a field full of what some people might think of as weeds, which is mostly considered forage. The narrowleaf plantain, there's a little bit of burdock in there. Not my favorite not my favorite forb, but it is edible in the vegetative stage. There's dandelion, and then this cute little, can you guys see my cursor if I wiggle it around? I'm guessing so. This little one here is burnet, a small burnet or a salad burnet. And then this one here is forage chicory. There's also some ragweed. And plant identification is really important to be able to figure out whether we're dealing with a perennial, a biennial, or an annual. And so here on my friend's hand is this is yarrow, and this is Queen Anne's lace. So one is a biennial, one is a perennial, and they're managed really differently. So figuring out what the weed is important. Then we can dig into the details on what we can do to prevent them from getting established on our farms to begin with, what can we do to stop them from getting worse? And then if we really need to eradicate them, what's the best approach to eliminate those from the field or ideally from the farm?
Sarah, we can see your cursor. Sorry, I didn't answer you earlier.
Okay, good. Thanks. So weed prevention, I'm going to start with weed prevention, then we'll talk about stopping the spread, then we'll talk about eradication. This is where the grazing management gets to be really important. So we can talk about grazing management as a way to control the weeds, but I really like to start by talking about good grazing management as a method to set up our pasture plant canopy and our soils to stop the weeds from getting established to begin with. So number one is high plant density, no bare soil visible. So that's as many grass tillers as possible per square foot. It's also having a mixture, as you can see in this really nice high quality pasture here, in addition to the grasses. There's also 4 different legume species growing in that field. It's actually red clover, white clover, vetch, and bird's foot trefoil. And then there's also multiple forb species. And forbs is the category where on some farms it's going to be a weed, on other farms it's going to be a forage. When it's a forage, I usually refer to those as the forbs. So then in addition to that high plant density, which limits the number of seeds, weed seeds that can get established on bare ground and germinate and get established, I also want to have the grazing management leave behind sufficient residue and residual on the soil surface. So you're protecting that soil surface so there's less bare ground. The residue is the broken off physical material. So it might be broken off grass leaves or stems, might even be, a little bit of cattle manure sitting on that soil surface, protecting that soil surface. The residual is also very important. That's how much of the still living pasture plant that is left behind. So that's your post-grazing residual is that that stubble that's hopefully 4 to 6 inches or so left of the plants, so they're not being grazed down too short. So that's more things that protect that pasture from having visible bare soil. Then each time you graze or mow off that pasture, the faster that you can get the plants to regrow in the pasture, the lower the chances of weeds from germinating and getting established. And then wherever your growing season is, usually there are times of the growing season where plants grow slower and faster. When there's a midsummer slump, when it's hotter and drier and things don't grow as well, that's a lot of times when weed seeds have an opportunity in that more open canopy with plants going dormant or being less productive. That's one of the times of the year we could really try to change our management so that we have more vigorous plant growth in our pastures over a longer growing season. We also ideally can shift our management so we have more perennials and less annuals in our pastures and move towards higher plant diversity. That also helps maintain a better cover throughout the overall grazing season. And then early detection, really developing some pasture monitoring skills so that you catch problems early in your grazing management so you can start to correct that, make a course correction, and shift the management back towards a system that encourages that more vigorous growth and higher plant density and less bare soil. And the 2 photos in this slide is really interesting because this is 2 different farms that were about 5 miles apart on exactly the same soil type. And they initially planted a very similar pasture seed mix, but then they had what appeared to be pretty subtle differences in management of those pastures. The pasture that's very lush and tall, that's about 20 inches deep. You can barely walk through it, it's so thick. That farmer very carefully had variable regrowth or variable recovery periods after each grazing for many years. So he was never returning animals to a pasture until the grasses had multiple mature leaves, were fully physiologically recovered. And so his recovery periods in his area varied from about 30 days to about 45 and sometimes 60 days between grazings. The farm with the obviously lower plant density, he also did, similarly. They're both dairy farms. The cows were only in each paddock for half a day, so that's pretty good grazing management. He also had variable recovery periods, but they varied between 17 days when things were growing fast and 30 days when things were growing more slowly. So it was the difference in the amount of time that the plants were given to regrow between grazings is what allowed one farm to establish this very high density, very high diversity, mostly perennial plants. And then the farm where you see the low plant density, he thought everything was fine until he had a very dry summer, and then the pasture looked like this area here. And at that point, he realized that he had lost a lot of those perennial grasses. He had a lot of annual grasses in there and a lot of biennial and annual weeds that didn't do well in that drought. So this is an example of where that monitoring and observation to catch things early would really have helped that farmer. So tools and goals for weed prevention: a good grazing system, leaving behind that good residue and residual deep plant roots, a diversity of different types of roots, maintaining the right level of soil fertility, keeping an eye on soil aggregation, organic matter content, making sure you've got good water infiltration and water holding capacity in the soil, looking for things like dung beetles and earthworms to monitor biological activity, and making sure you don't have soil fertility deficiencies limiting growth. So this is, in addition to soil tests, I also like to do shovel tests where I'll dig up a piece of the soil in the pasture and look at the aggregation, look at the root health, look at the color of the soil. And here you can see this is a little bit more compacted and less healthy, whereas this chunk here that we've picked up is beautifully aggregated, and those aggregates are holding onto the soil. And this can make a huge difference in terms of soil health and being able to maintain better perennial forages. Sometimes there's also limiting factors, such as really wet soils. This is a sedge here, a triangular stemmed plant that looks like a grass but is not. Sedges have edges, is the botany nerd way of reminding ourselves that these plants that look like not very productive grasses coming into these wet areas, they may really be what grows best if those soils are significantly saturated a lot of the time. And those will be difficult to get rid of unless you can change the drainage. And then there's also soils where there's such severe surface compaction or even deeper compaction that that'll limit improvements in being able to stop the spread of weeds. So just a couple of quick slides on what I mean by good grazing management. There's so many different terms that people use for good grazing management. I don't tend to use any of them. I just talk about good grazing management versus not so good grazing management. So ideally, in a good grazing management system, we're paying a lot of attention to the perennial grass plants, as well as the legumes and forbs, but the grasses really are what we should be focusing on to make sure everything else is being managed well. And we want to be managing to protect the crown, which is right here in the grass plant, at or just above the soil surface for most of our cool season and warm season grasses. That's where the growing points for new tillers are. And this photograph is one from my book, and these are little vegetative tillers. here, and then there's one that is drawn in as elongated and going into the seed production stage. But these tillers are what we want more of per square foot to increase that plant density and crowd out the weeds. And the growing points for new tillers are typically down at that crown near the soil surface or just above the soil surface. We also need to think about protecting that plant's energy reserves, which is generally the bottom few inches of the grass stem, as well as the crown, is where the plant is storing its energy for its regrowth. And so if you let your sheep or your cows graze those plants down too short, they're damaging not only those growing points and preventing future grass tillers from forming, but they're also eating the plant's energy reserves. And those plants' energy reserves are actually pretty non-digestible to the animals. So they're not really doing the animals any good, and they're damaging the plants. And so that frequent too short grazing is typically the prelude to having more weeds move into an area because those grasses get so damaged. So this is my definition of good grazing management. And so this might be a rotational grazing system. It could be management intensive. I think people call it regenerative grazing these days. But what we're looking for is a grazing system with variable regrowth or recovery periods between grazings that are determined on the plant's stage of maturity and making sure it's really fully physiologically recovered before it gets grazed again, and relatively short periods of occupation so that you're creating different stocking densities and you can really manage that residual, how much you leave behind, either standing or trampled, still attached to the plants. But making sure those periods of occupation are short enough that the animals aren't regrazing plants that are actively starting to regrow in the pasture. And that varies a lot depending on where you are geographically, how much rainfall you've had, the temperatures. In my northeast region of the US and Canada is generally it's somewhere around 3 days before plants in the pasture have regrown sufficiently that animals are starting to regraze those regrowing plants and you start to get overgrazing damage. But in drier areas, it may be more like a week. So this is a whole separate presentation that I'll often do called the Grazer's Toolbox, where I talk about all of the things that we can do as grazers to improve the pastures, the productivity, plant density, quality, all of that. Um, and so just putting this up here so we can think about the fact that like this is the high speed overview of how to change your grazing management to prevent the weeds from moving in. Then we can circle back and talk about any one of these things in the questions. So I did want to just reinforce what overgrazing damage is. Overgrazing damage is when an animal is grazing a plant, or it might be you going in with the mower for some reason while that plant is still regrowing from its carbohydrate reserves before it's regrown enough leaves to be growing from active photosynthesis. So it's when it's still depleting a previously stored energy reserve in the plant. And it commonly happens when animals are left in a paddock too long or they're brought back to a paddock too soon. And this photo here, you see all of these little lumps are buttercup. It's not the creeping buttercup, it's the other buttercup species. And it's mildly toxic and irritating to the animals' mouths. And so the only place that we see productivity in this pasture, which has been continuously grazed and has a lot of overgrazing damage, is where the plants are so unpalatable that the animals haven't been able to repeatedly graze them off. And so the way the plants in this pasture have adapted to that overgrazing is the ones that have survived have stayed very short and low growing, and anything that was much more productive and fast growing has been killed by that repeated grazing. And so this is the classic kind of pasture where these perennial weeds can move in and get established because they're less palatable than the grasses. So this is just the list of some of the things that I use as monitoring and observation points to make sure that the grazing system is preventing the weeds. And now we're going to get into the weeds themselves, and I'm just going to break them down into the three different categories. I try to immediately figure out, is it an annual that, it grows just for one season? It might be a summer annual or a winter annual. Is it a biennial where this is a biennial bull thistle here? This is what it looks like in the first year. It's just like a little prickly rosette. And then in the second year, it makes this huge Christmas tree sized thistle with a lot of seeds. And then here we've got a perennial, the Canada thistle, that sounds like a lot of you struggle with. And then here we've got an annual, one of the amaranth species that just seeds itself and grows in one season. So, especially since I work in a lot of different places, the first thing I need to do is make sure that we are accurately identifying the plant. So, a lot of times I do try to figure out what the Latin name is so that I'm on the same page with the farmer. Some of the plants, like down here, creeping buttercup, it sounds like that's one that a lot of you struggle with. When I talk about creeping buttercup, I know that these are all of the other names I've seen it go by: creeping meadow buttercup, devil's guts, granny threads, ram's claws, sit fast, or tether toad. And so I need to figure out first, are we talking about the same plant? And then once I've figured out that, I want to know which category are each of these weeds in, because that's going to help me figure out how to prevent them or get rid of them. So Canada thistle is particularly difficult because it's a rhizomatous perennial, which means it spreads by roots as well as by seeds. And then let's see, some of the other ones. Burdock is much easier to get rid of. It's a biennial spread by seed. And then some of these are spread and have allelopathic properties, so they're actually killing the other plants in the pasture. And then some of them have some toxicity issues, which make them harder to control. So we can come back to these in detail. So the annual weeds are the easiest ones to prevent or control with just good grazing management. These two, lamb's quarters and barnyard grass, are pretty palatable. The weeds germinate if you are able to graze them or mow them off. That will prevent them from making seed or reduce the number of seeds. So you can start to deplete the seed bank of these over time just by changing your grazing management or the timing of mowing. Then the biennial weeds are an interesting bunch. This is the Queen Anne's lace. This is bull thistle. This is a really toxic to the skin. It's not poisonous for the animals to eat, but it causes a photosensitive rash, and this weed's spreading in our area. It's in the parsley family, and then this is burdock. And so these are all examples of what these weeds look like when they're in that first summer, where you might not notice them unless you're really looking for them. Then when you go into year 2 with these weeds, that's when they go into the seed production stage. And so if you're able to control them either in year 1, where they're just growing a taproot and photosynthesizing, if you can control them at some point that season or at the beginning of the next season before they go into seed production, you can reduce or eliminate the spread of these weeds. That's one of the bull thistles just starting to grow taller in its second year, so that would be a great time to mow it off. So the annuals and the biennials, these are the easy ones. You want to notice the seedlings of the annuals in that first year, of the biennials in the first year. Notice the seedlings of the annuals as soon as they appear. You can take care of them by grazing if they're palatable and non-toxic, trampling, mowing. All of those things will prevent the seed production, reduce the seed bank of them. Another thing that often gets overlooked is just managing the desirable productive pasture plants really well so they're able to outcompete the weed species. And sometimes we get too aggressive with our mowing of the weeds, and we actually make things worse by damaging the productive pasture forages by mowing them too short and too often, and then the weeds can take over. So that's definitely something we can chat about more. Maintaining high plant density, good residue and residual as we talked about it. And then we can also discuss feeding out hay. Sometimes it gets called bale grazing in areas to smother or change the plant species composition and boost soil fertility. That can sometimes be very helpful. It can also cause damage to the soil if it's not done at the right soil moisture conditions. This was previously a huge patch of burdock, which was just defoliated by this group of beef cattle. And so using those high stock densities and grazing through the non-toxic, relatively palatable weeds and calling them forbs can certainly be a way to eliminate or certainly significantly reduce weeds. But you have to make sure that they aren't toxic ones, and you really have to be thinking about the nutritional needs of that group of animals. So I'm comfortable doing this with a herd of beef cattle. I would not do this with dairy cows at this stocking density because I think it would impact milk production. But goats would do very well in that sort of a system. Some of our desirable forage species also don't like severe trampling or too frequent trampling or being grazed too short too often or mowed too short too often. This is one of my favorite forage forbs. This is forage chicory, and it's one that does really well in pastures, but it is similar to alfalfa. It doesn't like to get grazed very short very often. This is also a warm season grass, similar, does not like to be grazed down very short, especially early in its growth cycle. So we really have to be thinking in terms of our mowing and grazing to get rid of those weeds. Is it also damaging the plants we're trying to encourage in the pastures? All right. So now that was the easy stuff. Now I want to talk a little bit about the unpalatable plants, toxic plants, spreading plants. This is the non-creeping buttercup. It spreads by seeds. It's a perennial. Once it's established, it has a very significant root system, and you can keep it under control, but you can't really eradicate it very well without significant tillage or disturbance to break up that root ball and replace those plants with improved forage species. And you can get the animals to eat a little bit of it, but the toxicity does cause irritation in the mucous membrane and so they won't eat very much of it, and you can't really push them to eat very much of it. So then this is one of the knapweed species, and I saw that quite a few of you listed knapweed as one of your problem weeds, so we should definitely talk about those. There are a lot of different knapweeds, so depending on where I am, I've encountered, I think, 3 or 4 different knapweed species in the last few years. They all seem to be quite problematic in that they are allelopathic. They at least the ones that we're encountering in the east here, they are decreasing plant diversity in the pastures. And it seems that it is due to some of their allelopathic properties where they're killing the plants around them. And so what we notice is once that perennial gets established, we're having a really hard time getting the more productive grasses to grow close to those plants and be competitive. So we're having to try all different sorts of techniques to try to get rid of the knapweed and replace it with improved forage species. I do, this is one, it's not toxic. Livestock are grazing most of the knapweed species, and we're able to keep them under control with a combination of grazing and mowing. But in order to really shift the plant species composition back towards a cool season perennial grass legume forb mixture to, say, support finishing livestock on finishing beef cattle or supporting a dairy herd, we are having to go to more radical methods, tillage and herbicides, depending on the farm, to get rid of some of this. So then the spreading perennial weeds are another category of challenging weeds to deal with. This is Canada thistle, in this case coming into an area where bales were fed out in the winter, and it created quite a bit of soil compaction damage. And there were just a few Canada thistles in there, and they really took the opportunity with the damaged grasses and the low plant density to spread by their amazing root system and really took over and dominated the area. And so I do often see the Canada thistle coming in these disturbed areas. And it can also be spread, the roots can get spread as well as the seeds if you're moving around with tillage equipment trying to control it. I saw some really interesting stuff this year on several farms where there was a bacterial infection that was being spread, some by just naturally and some intentionally, around the Canada thistle, and had killed whole areas of the Canada thistle. It was not a like, it wasn't a store-bought biological control, but it was definitely biological control that was working. And I should mention, actually, with the knapweed, there are several species of weevils and insect that people are experimenting with releasing, that either attack the root or the seed of some of the knapweeds. None of you mentioned horse nettle, but that's another one that spreads by both seed and a rhizome. Can be a challenging one because it's got the thorns on it. So the problematic perennials, these really are the hardest ones to deal with. The tools in the toolbox are managing and increasing the desirable species to outcompete them as long as the weed population isn't too high yet. Clipping, mowing, and grazing those perennials to prevent the spread, but you won't necessarily kill those perennials doing that. Feeding out bales, doing trample reseeding in those areas as long as you're not creating more soil compaction. Some of these do have some biological control options. Herbicides, if that is an option on your farm, can be useful, though it can also be damaging if you're damaging the desirable perennial forages in the pasture. And then we can move into doing some sort of tillage and reseeding process. My experience with these problematic perennials is, if you decide tillage is your option, it doesn't always work well to just go in, plow up, harrow, and reseed an area to an improved perennial forage immediately, because you usually have too much of a weed seed bank, as well as the very vigorous, tenacious roots, whether it's a spreading stoloniferous root or a rhizomatous root, or whether it's just the root ball of something like a buttercup. And it really takes some time to break down those roots and the weed seed bank before it's worth spending the money on that improved perennial forage mix. So usually what we're doing is we're plowing up and reseeding and growing an annual crop, either for grazing or for harvest. Typically what we've been using here in the East have been summer warm season cover crop for grazing, like a millet or a sorghum sudan grass, often mixed with some legumes and other plants. That'll be grown for a season. Sometimes if the weed seed bank and the roots seem to be still very persistent, we'll then do an overwintered like a small grain or something like that to um, provide a little bit more forage and continue to break up that weed problem before we then can invest the money in doing the permanent seed down to a perennial. And the
Sarah, I'm sorry, just jump in really quickly.
yeah,
Timing wise, we're doing okay. We're a little bit over time, but I think we're okay. What's your sense of how much longer you're,
I think this is my last
oh,
slide.
I should have just sat back and let you go. Okay, carry on.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the grazing system, if you're going to spend the money on the reseeding, it's also critical that the grazing system that allowed the problem to get started um, needs to be changed. So you really need to design that new improved grazing system at the same time that you're doing this reseeding process. And I do think that is my last slide. Yep.
Oh, I wished I had have waited one more minute. Sorry about that.
So I've got more slides that we can look at if it seems useful. But I just kind of wanted to set the context, and then we can see how this relates to what the weeds are actually on your farm and what folks have already tried to prevent them and eradicate them. And then we can start tying all the pieces together and dig into some specific weeds.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. I we can dive into specific weeds. I might get people to bring forth those questions. Well, I do actually have one question on the chat, which I'll put to you now, but also I'll open it up to everybody. If you have any questions, just raise your hand. But I'll start with this one here from Alison. What's the right balance between stock density and soil compaction? And there was Joseph did actually chime in there,
Okay.
but I'll let Sarah answer there first.
So I'm glad the first question is about soil compaction. I am seeing that soil compaction is increasingly the number one problem on a bunch of the farms that I work with. And it's being caused, at least on this side of the continent, by the fact that we are having less time in the winter when our soils are fully frozen. And so when animals have access to thawed soils in the winter, that's when we see quite a bit of surface compaction happening. The lighter the animal, the shallower the compaction, but it's still that surface compaction. And I'm also seeing, a lot of enthusiasm for feeding out bales on pasture during the non-grazing season to add fertility and trample weeds and things. But again, if the soil is wet and not frozen, and the higher the clay content, then the more of that compaction that we get. And then I'm also seeing compaction from heavier haying equipment or mowing equipment, and that causes deeper compaction in the soil. So it's a really big deal. So stock density, there's two different numbers. There's stocking rate, which is the total number of animals on the farm. Stock density, which is what this question is about, is the total number of animals or the total pounds of animal per acre. And so stocking density, if is generally it's going to be a lot of animals for a short period of time, followed by that long recovery period. So if you put if you have 100,000 pounds of animal per acre, but they're only in there for half a day, that stock density, unless the ground is very wet and particularly if it has clay in it, generally that high stock density is not going to be damaging to the soil because it's a short period of occupation. Then they're out of there, and you get that pulsing of the plants growing up tall and the roots growing down deep in there. But if you had a lot of animals in a paddock for an extended period of time, that's when you start to see more serious soil compaction problems. All of this becomes much more difficult if you also have clay soils, and the heavier the clay soil, the more serious that compaction can be. And so on the farms with those really tricky soils, I do see people using even shorter periods of occupation. And I was just speaking with some dairy farmers from Ireland, and they will sometimes, when it's very wet, do literally like a 2 or 3 hour period of occupation. The cows just go out, they graze, and then they bring them right back into a barnyard with supplemental feed to protect those soils from compaction. Um, so I hope that answered the question.
There's another question here from Janice. If I overseed in the heavy thistle and rest that area for half of the year with just high mowing, will that be effective?
That's a good question. It really depends on the plant density. If I find that those thistle patches sometimes have such incredible plant density that the overseeding with an improved forage mix doesn't necessarily get established in those areas. Um, but if you don't have the improved forages in there and it's thistles and other plants that you don't really like, that's a situation where you could do a really short mowing or some sort of, disturbance and try no-till drilling in, um, a nice improved mix with good fertility. And then you could see if that would work. But it really depends on the plant density of what's there and the density of the thistles. I often see thistles are so aggressive and fast growing that they will shade out new seedings if they're really dense.
Okay. There were some comments earlier just on the thistle note is that it seems like people have Scotch thistle as well as Canadian thistle here, which is fun.
And is Scotch thistle, I think that one's a biennial, right?
I don't personally know enough to answer with confidence. I'm a vegetable farmer. Um, but
Does
I'm
our
sure
agronomist know?
maybe Greg can jump in.
Yeah.
He's just unmuting himself.
I'll jump in once I look it up to be sure, okay?
Okay, sounds good. We'll move on to another question quickly. Florian is saying, in your experience, what's the best way to control orange hawkweed? That's a tough one.
So it's interesting because this is one that is not a big problem for us here. We have it,
Hmm.
but we rarely encounter it as a serious problem. I'm just looking at my notes on the hawkweeds. Yeah. Okay. So this one is a perennial, spreading by seed, and rhizomes. Um, and yeah, so it's not one I have a huge amount of personal experience with, so I might bump that one over to Greg also.
Mhm.
But I would be going for all of those same things that we're talking about with any one of those. It's in the problematic perennial weed category. Um, and but it is one that is less like it's less of doesn't grow quite as fast and as tall as the Canada thistle, but I know it can be very high density and really dominate an area. So that's another one where I'd potentially be looking at one of the more disruptive ways of getting it to be reseeded. But I would definitely be looking for local expertise on that one since it's not one that we really
Mm.
see as a weed very much.
I know it's completely covers my farm. I don't have livestock though, but that's a hard one to control. Greg, do you have input on the Scotch thistle and or orange hawksweed?
Yeah, the Scotch thistle is a biennial and occasionally acts as an annual. And the orange hawkweed is not something that I'm very familiar with, but there's a
Mm.
really good paper on the BC Invasive Council's website that goes through it if people want to look at that, as well as if you're in the interior, there's a number of weed specialists that work with the Ministry of Forests that can help you with it because they've been struggling with it for decades. But
Mm.
fortunately, I haven't had to.
So there's a comment that I think is helpful that just came in that says in our area, yellow hawkweed is the major problem. On our farm, it grows where soil is compacted or infertile. And
Mm.
that is exactly what I see also with these rhizomatous, stoloniferous, perennial spreading weeds is they have an amazing competitive advantage in low fertility soils where the soils have kind of depleted over time, or whether there's been some sort of soil compaction. And I actually, somewhere or other, I have photographs the um, of the roots of thistles. Oh yeah, I'm just going to do a quick screen share because when when I was talking about how I think it's really important to go out with a shovel and do shovel tests on your farm, that really gives you an idea of what the underground growing conditions are for your plants, and it'll help you get some insight into why some of the weeds might have a competitive advantage. Can you guys see that slide pretty well?
Yes.
So speaking of problematic weeds, this is multiflower flora rose. These photographs, I wasn't so much photographing the weed above ground. I was photographing the amazing work that the roots of these weeds were doing to alleviate some of the problems in these pastures. So this was a terribly compacted pasture with awful soils. And I was going around doing shovel tests, and we were coming up with all these ideas to improve the soil so that the weeds would stop spreading. And then I took the time to dig up one of the multiflora rows, and it was the best soil in the whole field. And the roots in this multiflora rose were just doing an amazing job of spreading, breaking up the compaction and reaggregating the soils. And then here we're looking at quackgrass, doing the same thing with these like spreading rhizomes. And then I think there's one more. Oh yeah, and there's one of the biennial thistles, and so when we have those really difficult soils, all of our picky, fancy, improved grasses and legumes aren't going to do well, and the weeds are really going to have a competitive advantage. And so sometimes you really have to go in and address soil fertility deficiency and really create some surface disruption to break those things up. Especially there's actually a note about this here. I see says mowing low on basal-leaved plants gives them the advantage. Because that leaves these little basal rosettes that are right on the soil surface, and you just mowed off everything that was shading them, and now they get the sun. And so that's where that hawkweed, because it's got those little low leaves, and then it's got the really, the pretty orange flowers that come up. And that's similar for things like Queen Anne's lace in its first year, and the biennial thistles, the Scotch thistle or the bull thistle or the burdock in its first year, is you might be just mowing and damaging the perennial pasture plants that you want and getting sunlight onto those low growing rosettes. So really figuring out what is the life cycle of your problem weed and where can you interrupt it without damaging your perennial plants.
Great. People are putting questions in the chat, which is great. I would encourage people to join the discussion and unmute yourselves and raise your hands. I get it if you don't want to, that's okay, but it would be nice to have people discussing with each other. There's a lot of knowledge in this Zoom room. So it'd be great to share. I'm just going back up to a question from Julia. How do you manage weed control with variable regrowth timing in mixed species pastures?
Yes, so ideally all of your pastures are mixed species. When I put together a pasture mix, I'm usually putting together, 3 or 4 different species of grass, 2 to 4 legumes, and a couple of different forb species in most of my pasture mixtures. And so then, the more diversity you get, the harder it is to know exactly when should we consider that pasture as fully recovered at the ideal physiologic state to turn the livestock in to graze again or mow if you're making hay. And that's where usually I use the grasses as my guide. And I will pick individual grass tillers off of the grass plants during the regrowth process and try to get a sense of how quickly are new intact grass leaves appearing on those grass tillers. So when the grass first starts regrowing, they'll usually re-elongate individual bitten off leaves for a little while. And there's some photographs of this in my book. I don't think I brought any with me, but you'll kind of see these like flat-tipped grass leaves that'll get longer for a little while. We're not counting that. That's just like the immediate regrowth stage of these perennial grasses. What we're really looking for is new grass leaves emerging on these tillers. And we want to have at least 3 new leaves on the tiller before we graze. And you can start to notice, depending on the grass species that you're managing, you'll have new leaves emerging, and eventually you'll get the initial leaf that started to regrow will start to die off lower down on that grass tiller. And that generally means those grasses are fully recovered and ready to graze. And so I usually go with the grasses on the assumption that then the rest of the plants in the pasture are going to also be ready to graze. And the difference is, like, if you're growing some really interesting forb or browse species, sometimes those need longer recovery periods. So a couple of the goat dairies that I'm working with that are very intentionally managing for highly diverse forb dense species with things like the forage chicories, cup plant, which is an interesting one, though considered an invasive in some areas, and some of the woody browse species, they're judging that recovery period based on those plants that need the longest recovery periods. One of the challenges is if you are waiting for your ideal pasture plants to be fully recovered and you have a problematic weed that is starting to look like it's going to produce seeds. And that's where you do have to figure out the timing of going in with a mower, or somehow cutting those flower heads off before they produce seed. And that can be really helpful as a way to stop it from setting more seed. But if you go in with that mower and you set the mower too low, or you are going in with the mower when those desirable pasture plants are in that really critical in-between regrowth phase, that's when you can really damage the ideal pasture plants and give the weeds even more of a competitive advantage. So it's not always really simple to figure out the timing of when to graze or when to mow to control the weeds without damaging some of the other pasture species.
Right. There's another message here from Janice, and it's actually specifically about yarrow. You haven't mentioned yarrow. They won't eat it, and the leaves look like a lot like Queen Anne's lace that you're showing.
Yes, the yarrow leaves and the Queen Anne's lace are actually really hard to tell apart in the first year. They smell different, so that's one way that you can tell them apart. So both of them are relatively low palatability. I don't mind a little tiny bit of Queen Anne's lace and a small amount of yarrow in my pastures. But if I see it spreading, generally, if the yarrow is really spreading, it sounds a little bit like what happens with yarrow here might be what happens with the hawkweed in your area. The kind of low growing leaves at the base and then the flowers, stems sticking up, typically coming into soils that have some compaction and low fertility or declining fertility. And the Queen Anne's lace is a biennial, and I often see that coming in after we've had a period of low plant density. And so our climate is really changing a lot here. We're starting to get longer periods of dry weather in the summer than we've had in the past. And we don't have the ideal mixture of plant species composition in our pastures or the depth of soil and depth of roots for our plants to do really well when we have these extended dry periods. And so that's resulting in low plant density at times, as we have a number of plants in our pasture that'll go dormant or even die in some cases or be weakened. And so we'll come out of a dry season and then the next year we'll have a wet spring, but with lower plant density. And that's where we see things like the Queen Anne's lace really start to germinate. And we'll have a huge number of the little tiny low growing rosettes of that biennial in the understory of the pasture. You might not necessarily notice it unless you're crawling around on your hands and knees and identifying what's growing in the understory, and maybe smelling the difference between the yarrow and the Queen Anne's lace leaves. But then that following year, we'll have a sudden explosion of the number of Queen Anne's lace flowers popping up and producing seed. So a lot of times you kind of have to look back 2 or 3 years previous and think, what happened here with my grazing management? What happened with the climate? What was going on with the plant density? So now I'm seeing this weed problem 3 years in. And what happened back then? It's harder to fix then, but at least then you understand kind of the pattern that is allowing some of these weeds to get worse.
Great. She just made another comment. It spreads and they won't eat the grass. It grows through. Could be compaction though. Sorry, did you want to make a comment on that, Sarah?
Yarrow is one of those ones where, like if you read Newman Turner's books on, herbal lays, the highly diverse kind of medicinal pastures that he wrote about, he actually recommended planting a little bit of yarrow in the pasture. And it's one of those ones where in a small amount, it's probably beneficial. But as soon as you get too much of it, it's problematic. I do find that in low amounts, they will eat it at the correct stocking density. And there's some really interesting work by Fred Provenza. I don't know if any of you are already familiar with that. He did research at Utah State University for many years, looking at the post-ingestive feedback that grazing livestock get from grazing one type of plant or eating one type of food and then going and eating another type of food, and how that determines their choices on what they graze and what they don't graze. He's got some great publications and videos on this. And so grazing, what animals might choose to eat on your farm is going to be different than what they choose to eat on your neighbor's farm, because it's often within the context of everything that they're eating. So they might eat a plant that's a little bit toxic if they're also eating a plant that has something in it that can alleviate those toxins. And there's also, the types of food that you might be supplementing within the barn will change their grazing behavior in terms of what they'll want to eat out in the pasture. And so these are the pieces where I might have 30 some odd years of experience helping farmers with this sort of thing, but it's so very farm specific that like your unique set of what you're feeding and your livestock, is going to mean that maybe on your farm they really won't eat the yarrow, but on your neighbor's farm they will eat the yarrow. It's not one of the toxic plants, and so that's really kind of a grazing behavior. There was also some follow-up research done by Kathy Voth and I think Daryl Emick, where they looked at how to intentionally change the grazing behavior of livestock by kind of training them to eat some of these non-toxic but not quite as palatable weeds. And they were quite successful with changing the grazing behavior of some of the flocks of sheep and beef herds that they were working with. But again, like I tend to work a lot with dairy cow farms, and so I don't want to force those animals to learn how to eat a weed. because the fiber digestibility is probably lower. It's going to impact milk production and the farm's net income and profitability. But if I'm working with a goat farm or a beef herd where the forage quality is good enough for the beef cows and we have some capacity to push them to eat more of those weeds, then I might focus more on trying to change the stocking density or the grazing behavior of the animals to get them to eat more of those weeds, as long as they're not the super non-palatable ones or toxicity issue ones.
Thanks, Sarah. There's a couple more comments. I'll read them out, but we are going to move on just in the name of time. But one of them is just a comment from Kurt and Betsy. My Canadian friends who are European immigrants say that yarrow is actually medicinal and it's strengthening the reproductive system of ewes and cattle.
Yeah, it's an amazing plant.
Yeah.
And if you really are a botany nerd, which I am, you can dive into the science of the secondary plant metabolites, and the phytochemistry of these individual plants. And they have some remarkable medicinal properties. Sometimes those are toxic medicinal properties, and sometimes they can be beneficial. But it's an interesting, like a lot of the weed identification books that I use are actually medicinal herb identification books because they're often the same plants.
That's so interesting. Yeah, and Julia's agreeing there that it's powerful, can be used to stop bleeding too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, so people are asking about the recording, if it's going to be shared. Yeah, it's going to be shared on the Small Scale Meat Processors Association's website, on Organic BC's website, and I'm pretty sure our funders, IAF, will also have a recording of it somewhere on their website. But we'll send you, every participant, a link as well. We're going to move on to the next section. There's going to be time for more questions at the end as well. So if anything comes up for Sarah, you can ask at the end. I'm just going to take you off spotlight there, Sarah. Thank you so much. This is fantastic, but this is not the end. We will discuss more at the end. We're going to move now to the three farmers from around BC. And Joseph, are you okay to start? Yeah, okay, we'll get started on you. I'm going to put the spotlight on you and then I'll give you a little introduction. You have the ability to screen share if you want to.
Perfect. I got a couple photos. So.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so anytime you can just screen share.
So try to figure that out.
Yeah, down the bottom there. You got it? There should be, yeah, you're good. Okay. I'll let you introduce yourself. I'll give you a quick introduction, though, of what I know about you. You run Avonlea Ranch in Vavenby, BC, and you're going to discuss your experience with targeted grazing Canadian thistle, which seems to be a big one for everyone, with sheep and cattle. Yeah, so carry on. So technically we have like 5 minutes. If you go a little over, that's okay. But we'll go through the three farmers and then we'll open up to questions after that.
Okay, perfect. I think I only have 9 slides and I'll try to go through them quickly.
No, you don't need to.
Thank you again so much, Sarah, for sharing that topic. That I learned a lot of new things and it confirmed a lot of theories. And I think I'm glad which pictures I chose for this. So yeah, so my name is Joseph Molliot. For those who don't know me, I'm a 4th generation rancher, and our family's been ranching in the North Thompson Valley, about a 2-hour drive north of Kamloops in the interior of BC. And so we've been here since 1906. My grandfather homestead, and yeah, so I got kind of 2 different grazing trials. The first couple of photos is one that was done in 2022. And actually, there's not, other than this picture right here that you see, there's not too many photos in the first couple of slides showcasing Canada thistle, because I was actually trying to capture the high density grazing that we were trialing. So this is kind of the first real ultra high stock density rotational graze trial that we had done. So this was on a hay field. So it was basically fully mature, but it wasn't over mature. It was in June, late June. And we kind of decided to do it just because the weather wasn't cooperating. And there was a level of semi-problematic patches of Canada thistle that had been persistent for many, many years. and it never
Hey,
really.
Joseph, do you
Yeah.
want to put your slides on slideshow?
Oh, I thought I did. My
We can see the pictures more better.
how can I go back here? Just a minute.
If you go up to, I think,
Green.
custom slideshow at the top there,
Oh, I can't find. Oh, there, that one.
resume slideshow.
Oh, I can't. I'm covered up here.
Oh,
Okay, no
Can you
biggie.
minimize my screen?
I won't be able to do anything on my end, but it's literally within PowerPoint or whatever you're using there. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Okay. Just
if you can't figure it out, it's okay. It just the pictures would be bigger, but it's
I
okay.
am digitally impaired, so
You know what? It's
but
not. It's fine.
okay.
If you
Carry on.
can't
Anyway,
if you
there was
can't
Yeah,
some
see it,
captions,
yeah,
but not
good.
overly
there
important.
you go.
Oh,
There
there
you
we
go.
go.
You got
Good
it.
job.
Oh,
I don't know how it
nothing
started.
changed on my screen, so I don't know
Oh,
why I did.
weird. Okay.
Okay. Okay, so you can see everything. Good.
Hmm.
Yeah, so this is mainly just showcasing the high stock density grazing. So this is kind of the first time we really did this, and I'll share some of the results after. So now, did that just move? Because now I'm not seeing anything.
No, we're on the first slide still, and it's in a
Oh,
full
there you go.
screen mode.
It's not very.
There you
Okay,
go.
so yeah, we were doing this with about 700 ewe lamb pairs in June. So you can see the first paddock there has already been crushed, creamed, grazed, and we were doing. We had to do actually pretty long rectangular paddocks here with front fences and back fences. This is about a third of the way through the pasture, so you can see the whole mob entering into the middle of the paddock. So it's a pretty skinny paddock. So the front fence, you can't see it. It's hidden in the grass, but that's the kind of forage we were taking down. So basically what you would hay and bale up. And like I said, there was various thistle patches in that pasture, which our plan was to trample as much as possible. So kind of to reflect what Sarah was talking about, that was kind of our goal. And you can see the whole flock there comfortably filled up their paddock there just before we would lock them in. So you can see how tall the forage is. And yeah, they did pretty well with this. They respected the fences, and yeah, they did basically exactly what we were looking at. And so this is kind of what I wanted to show too, with what you get with a long rectangular paddock as opposed to a square. Generally, the closer you get to a square, the more even grazing you're going to get, which is often what you do want. In this situation, we wanted really uniform trample. So we were kind of happy to be confined to using the long rectangles, because in the sheep kind of ping pong, they go back and forth, and they get a really nice consistent trample. And they do absolutely pull up any good forage that they have trampled. They don't leave it. So they'll kind of go through it. They'll try to eat everything that's at eye level. And then once they've done that, they'll literally start pulling everything up and even digging through the thatch layer, because you're basically making a mulch layer like you would on your garden. And so it's like, 6 inches, 5 inches thick in some places. And basically what we were trying to do here in regards to weed management, which again, that wasn't the primary objective of this trial, but in general, kind of my philosophy and theoretical thinking kind of started evolving to stop just targeting the weed, because I do believe weeds are symptoms of a problem. And just like what Sarah had said, we need to address the underlying problem and why there's a problem. This is a pretty healthy pasture. I know you're thinking there's probably no problems. Overall, it is a good pasture, but the thistle patches that we had persisting were very old. They'd been the communities of thistle had been basically there all my lifetime. And that's largely because we would hay it off usually late in the summer, because that's when you got weather. And then we would regraze the regrowth later in the summer or early fall, and it hadn't properly recovered. And so they would essentially overgraze it, remove all that litter, so that you'd go into the winter with no litter. And then in the springtime, we would often overgraze, get out there too early, which we kind of stopped doing. A lot of those things we corrected, but once those thistles get established, again, because of they're very robust rhizomes that just keep on spreading underground and popping up new plants, it's extremely hard to set them back once they're set, once they've got their footing. That's what it looks like when they're just about, oh, they're a few hours ready before they're about to be moved. But I just made a note that we clean them every 12 hours in this situation, so twice a day. And after grazing each paddock, that's roughly what we got for residue. So really nice heavy mulch layer. A lot of people would cringe. Actually, my dad kind of cringed at this because it's like, that's waste. That could have made how many extra bales, right? But I'd kind of realized that that was what was getting us into those problems with traditional management, and trying to get every last blade of grass off the field, I think really resulted in weakening the forage communities and allowing entry for the thistle. So that was our goal that you see. And again, you don't see too many thistles in this photo because I actually was trying to avoid it, because I was trying to use this more just for showcasing rotational grazing and high density grazing, mob stocking. But what we found that fall or later that summer, and with Canada thistle, it typically makes a very robust regrowth, especially if it's knocked down or clipped in the spring. And what we saw was actually the opposite. We saw very little thistle regrowth. And because the regrowth of the forage communities were so robust, it essentially crowded out the thistle. And I kind of theorized, I'm glad to see those photos that Sarah showed of underground, the underground photos of the roots. I'd kind of imagined that the root masses of my forage grasses were essentially taking over. A lot of the forage grasses that we had in that mix were rhizomatic, and so like brome, bit of couch grass, that kind of stuff. So I kind of felt, well, I think you maybe need a rhizomatic plant to fight off another rhizomatic plant. And that seems to have been what happened, because going forward, like I say, this was in 2022, so we've had lots of time to observe this pasture, and those thistle communities have absolutely been knocked back from what they were at. And this was definitely the perfect time for grazing. It was very optimal because even though it was mature, it wasn't over mature, which meant the thistles actually knocked over quite easily because they were more succulent and they had not developed a flower yet. They were just the pre-budding stage. So they were knocked down a little easier. Lots were still left standing. As you saw in the first photo, the sheep did strip a lot of leaves off and even graze some heads, which is pretty incredible for sheep to graze in a 12-hour period. So just that level of competition, because they were shoulder-to-shoulder grazing, encouraged them to graze a lot more of the thistle than they normally would. And then this is the second, we did a grazing trial we did this year, actually, or last year, and end of 25. So this field actually had a legit thistle problem. So I'm glad I did take these photos. You might think those are sheep out there. It's mostly, actually, there are sheep in the very far background. They just finished walking through this scene. And so you can see the fluffy, over-mature seed heads of the Canada thistle in most of that pan. And so again, that's the density, similar density. I think we were actually doing once a day, so every 24 hours on this particular paddock. It would have absolutely been better had we done it earlier in the season, but it just didn't work out that way with timing and whatnot. But yeah, despite the it wouldn't have been a very high quality crop because it was very mature, but they still did really well because they were only grazing like a third of the plant, which was the best, the optimal for nutrition. So their nutritional levels and their weights still did pretty well. So this is in August. The lambs, it's just pre-market for the lambs, so they're going to be butchered in the next month or two. And as I noted there, I am again using the back fence here. this is a situation where I could have not used a back fence because it's late in the year, the ground was dry, and they wouldn't have regrazed any shoots for the duration they were there. But for the sake of density, we wanted that back fence, and we were using 2 strands just because it was probably a little more dense than the previous photos you're looking at. So when the denser you are, especially with sheep, they have a tendency to kind of spill out of your fence. The lambs, especially, the lambs are a little bit less savvy and they tend to dart underneath. So when you're grazing sheep with high density, you're going to want to use more than 1 strand, probably for your front and back fence. And then the other thing we were able to do in this was mow directly behind, again, because of the just how mature everything was, including the thistles. They're a totally different beast than they were in that June grazing earlier in the video you saw. So they were not succulent, very spiny, very stiff, very, very prickly. So they didn't get trampled as well, and they were avoided more. Actually, it worked out because the thistles were so tall that they used them like trees for shade. And because we were getting some 30-degree weather here, and we didn't really have, or near 30-degree, I should say, and we didn't have much for tree shade, but the sheep were actually laying down and getting shade amongst the thistles. So I thought that was kind of cool. But yeah, it worked out to mow them down just to make sure everything was evenly reset for the next regrowing. And it was, again, like usually it is, a dry summer. And so we did put irrigation on this pasture within a week after we got the sheep off. So we got a good fall grazing crop that we waited for it to fully mature before we grazed again. And that's just what I've found. Like kind of in the past, our management strategy has simply been to mow after grazing. And if you're super consistent and do it at the right time, you will notice a difference just doing that. But you miss a couple years, the thistles come back in full density. And so I've just found that, in order to avoid herbicides, which is what we want to do, and I think everyone here probably does, we just found that doing this very aggressive, ultra high stock density mob grazing, whatever term you want to use, has been very effective for the medium and long term, like especially the long term, but also the medium. And I think it's something that it's a difficult type of grazing, especially the higher density you do it. It's more of a commitment. You're out there multiple times a day. You can get more problems. But if you have a serious problem or you seriously want to manage what problems you have, I'd really recommend people start experimenting with that. And if you got cows, it's going to be even easier. We also have cows, just a smaller bunch. So our heaviest bunch was the sheep. So that's why we use that. And I'll leave it at that, just so I don't take any more time up.
No, it's great. It's amazing information. Can you stop sharing your screen? I should technically be able to do it, but for some reason I can't.
Now I can't see. Oh,
beautiful.
Exit.
Yeah. If you go stop screen sharing, I mean, I should be able to do it. For some reason I can't.
No, I just see Zoom.
Okay, how about I do this? Yeah, this is still screen sharing. Oh, that's your email.
I might be able to do it, Sarah, if you want.
Whoever. I have co-hosts with me too. I don't know why I can't do it.
Oh, stop share. That would help, right?
There we go. Perfect. Thank you. I mean, I should, as the host, be doing that. We'll reserve questions until Amber and Julia have spoken. So thank you so much, Joseph. That was amazing. That's some really interesting stuff that you're doing. Amber, I'm gonna jump in to you next. We're a little bit tight on time. I don't want to rush you though, but just letting you know, if we can try to stick to 5-7 minutes, that would be great.
Yeah, feel free to let me know if I'm going over, but I don't have a massive presentation.
Okay, awesome. I'm also going to introduce you, Amber. So Amber owns and operates Brass Bell Farm on Vancouver Island in the Souk area. She's going to share a bit about managing invasives with chickens. Okay.
Can you see that? I will make it
bigger.
Hang on one sec. Or I will try. There we go. Okay. Hi everyone, my name's Amber, and like Sarah said, I run Brassbell Farm. We are on Southern Vancouver Island. Some nuance kind of behind this presentation. One is that when I took these photos, I had no intention of ever presenting on this topic, so they were just ones that I happened to have for my own brain and my own use. But I wish I had some sort of clearer before and after that were a little more dramatic, but you'll just have to take my word for it, I guess. So what we are dealing with on our farm, we lease our farmland. We've been leasing this land for several years, but it was in conjunction with another farmer. And then we took over in 2023, and we're the first farmers to be living and farming on this land 365 days a year in a very long time, which of course changes the way that that land is managed. So what we came into was this purple grass that you can see here with my lovely dog. And I would love to tell you exactly what it was, but we have not been able to get a solid identification on this grass. And we've had a number of folks come out and take a look at it. Quite a few farms in our area also deal with it. It's not unique to us, but it's a real pain because it has sort of taken over all of our pastures, and nobody really likes to eat it, and it goes to seed. It looks very beautiful when it's purple like this, but it goes to seed and then it just stays dormant in our fields. And in the past, because it wasn't being managed at all, it just created this really thick layer of thatch that was then inhibiting any kind of new growth as well. So in 2023, we had a really bad drought here, like a lot of folks did, and we basically shipped off the majority of our cattle because we did not have enough feed. So I kind of had to think, okay, like how am I going to address this grass problem when I don't have a high stocking density option of sort of larger ruminants? So something that we could do was use our chickens. So we've been raising broilers for, I think it's been about 12, 13 years now. And so we decided, let's just stick our chickens on this field and see what happens. So we have a number of these sort of portable chicken tractors. We raise our chicks inside till they're about 4 weeks and ready to go out. We have quite a cool, windy climate here, so we need to be a little bit sensitive of that and make sure we're not sticking them out there too early. But once they're feathered and doing well, we put them out in these tractors and then we can move them around, which is great. We have had quite a few renditions of chicken tractors over the years. I like these ones a fair bit because I can move them myself and we don't need the tractor. We don't need any other people. And they're very multi-purpose too. Like we will use them for our pigs or our sheep in the wintertime too, and we can move them all around the farm. So we started moving these tractors and our chickens through the fields where we had this really challenging grass. You can see them. The chickens thought it was great. You can sort of see that this grass now is just starting to seed out, and they do quite a good job of actually eating those seed heads as they come up. And at this point, the sheep and the few cows we had left and things were no longer really interested in our pastures at this point, but the chickens still thought it was great. So that was working out well for us. We do free range the chickens. They get locked in the tractor at night, but these broilers really don't go very far. So it was not an issue to have them out other than, you know, the odd one, but that's what the dog's for, right? So you can kind of start to see now. So they've been out there. Probably those ones would have gone out in the beginning of May. And so we would move them along where we had sort of the nice flatter straight stretches. And you can see they've left behind all the good chicken manure they've trampled down. They're actually kind of making a little bit of a difference in this otherwise sea of purple grass. And there's more of that. So yeah, you can see in here, they do really just strip the grass of the seed heads, which was beneficial in a lot of ways, but also just that many less seeds coming back and repopulating itself in the field. We do mow our fields with the tractor as well, because obviously we're not covering 40 acres of this stuff with broilers, but I would rather move chickens than drive the tractor around all day. So I appreciate that they were kind of a 2-for-1 deal in that management. So August, the ground had a little bit of rest. we got a bit of rain, and you can see that now there is actually some new growth coming back. And you can see that that other grass is more or less trampled or eaten, or something is, it's been impacted in some way, compared to the grass that was not in those areas and was not targeted, and it just seeded out and looks like that. And then at that point, nothing, of course, will touch it. So that's what was contributing to the thatch that we've been dealing with over the years as well. So we just did a little test enclosure to be sort of see like, well, what would happen if, you know, the geese can't get it, the deer can't get it, the rogue sheep can't get it. And we could sort of see the difference that it made where we'd run the chickens. Again, like I said, I wasn't planning to share this with anybody, so I don't have the best like before and after photos, but it gives you a little bit of an idea. And then we noticed too, as soon as the sheep had the opportunity, that's exactly where they wanted to be, was all on that fresh new growth. And of course, leaving the seeded out stuff alone. So that is what I have. I hope that was close to 5 minutes.
Yeah, that was amazing. And that, yeah, what an impact that it looks like everything your chickens had there. There's a couple of people who've written in the comments suggestions, and it sounds like you've probably gone through it, everything with all kinds of people. But someone mentioned, is it broom grass or red top? And there's actually a picture in the chat which looks similar. And I've seen this grass around too. Anyway.
I'll take Amber off the spot. Greg's been out there and looked at it, and I've had at
you've
least
been
two
there.
other people who have tried to do it,
Okay.
and we have not identified it. We
Got it.
have looked at red top. We've looked at different varieties of fescues, etc., but we haven't landed on one. Someday we'll find somebody
Okay.
who's a better botanist than we are.
Interesting. I'm going to move along to Julia now, and then we will open it up to questions to all three of you. And please feel free to put them in the chat, or we can open up discussions afterwards. But Amber, thank you so much. All right. Julia Smith, I'm just going to put a spotlight on you. Okay.
Hey, you guys seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So I told the other farmers, just bring 2 pictures. And yeah, they've both really showed me up. So I basically have 2 pictures. So we'll be able to move this along quickly. And Greg, if you get real lucky when I see you tomorrow, I've been driving around with a sample of Amber's mystery grass in my truck for a couple of weeks, so we can see what pulverized mess is left of it. Okay, I'm Julia Smith. I am farming in Merritt, and we're at about 1,000 meters. So it's a little different climate up there, and we're in a pretty dry, arid area. In fact, as I like to say, water does not fall from the sky anymore where I live. So it's been really challenging. See my YouTube video that we did with Sarah and Organic BC on adapting to climate change. One thing that you really notice in drought is that things like the plants that you don't want tend to really have an opportunity to thrive. So knapweed is my cross to bear in my region, along with so many of you by the sounds of things. I recently have pivoted my operation to sheep, and I'm finding them to be quite effective for knapweed. One thing I'll just mention is the importance of having the right tools for the job when you're grazing. So depending on which species you're using on which weeds, there's an electric fence for that. And it's really important that whatever you choose is easy, because if it isn't easy, you're not going to move it. And it might be something you're willing to move, but if you go away for work for a week, it better be easy for the guy you leave behind to move too. So just something to think about when you're designing your systems. So here's one of my 2 slides. So this is some of my sheep. This area, again, like Amber, I wasn't taking photos for a weeds webinar, so I don't have the greatest photos. This is an area that was just purple, really high concentration of knapweed. And the key for me has been just not giving them a choice, right? Like if I give them a nice big area and there's some knapweed in it, well, yeah, they're going to eat the candy first and the stuff that they really like. Whereas if I really force them into an area and that's what's for eats, like this, I tell people, like, no sheep ever died of starvation in a field full of knapweed. Like it's like your toddler, right? No child ever died of starvation sitting at a table with food in front of them. They're not going to die. That's what's for eats. You don't eat it today, I guess you're going to be hungry and you're probably going to eat it tomorrow. And so that's been pretty successful for me. And what's happening in this picture, I remember taking this picture because it just like filled my cold heart with joy. They're actually like reaching under this like zanging electric fence to get some more knapweed. And so then I knew I had won, and it was very satisfying. Another thing I'll just mention is the right timing on the plants that you're grazing. Different species might be more interested in different animal species might be interested in different plant species at different times in their reproductive cycle. So I had found that if I got the pigs on it early, they actually really enjoyed rooting it up. And so if you are running a multi-species operation, you might want to consider using the different animals that you have as strategic tools in your weed control at different times of year, because my sheep are happy to get on there once the knapweed starts flowering, but the pigs were happy to get on there earlier. And yeah, different fencing systems for different animals. But yeah, so for us, kind of like Amber, I would rather move animals around than machinery. And we did try the weevils on the knapweed, but in our situation, there's just so much of it. It knocks it back, but you know, when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of seeds, knocking it back 30%, it just isn't enough. So yeah, I think it can be a part of it, but if you're dealing with a really serious knapweed infestation, you're probably not going to be able to control it with weevils. And weevils don't taste as tasty as bacon and lamb chops. So why not turn those invasive species into something tasty? So yeah, that's pretty much it for me. Yeah, and I'm just remind everybody that grazing doesn't control invasive species, management does. And so it's really important that you set up your system so that you're able to make decisions in the field, not just in January when you're making your grazing plan and drawing lines and stuff. You really want to be looking at what's happening with your soil and your plants and what your pastures are telling you, so that your grazing plan can be nimble, so that you can respond and make good management decisions, so that you can really target your grazing to control those species. And that's it for Julia.
Thank you so much, Julia.
You're welcome.
Does anyone have any questions for Joseph, Amber, or Julia?
I'm curious if you know which species of knapweed you guys are dealing with. And I actually have some forage tests on knapweed in the vegetative stage, when it is it's pretty digestible, high protein.
Yeah, I meant to mention that. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, it's 18% protein is what I've read. Is that consistent with what you've got, Sarah?
Well, the test that I have, and again, this is where I wonder about the species, because some of them are a little bit more kind of vegetative and some of them are stemmier. The species that one of the farmers in New York State near me tested was 23% protein. The NDF was 33. And the digestibility was really pretty good. NDFD 30 was 59. And it also had a pretty high mineral content. His challenge is he's a dairy farmer, so he finds he can only push his cows to graze it with those higher stock densities earlier when it's vegetative, and then later when it heads out and becomes stemmy, then he has to use a different class of livestock to do that grazing management because he can't push his cows to eat it. But he does feel like he's getting some control over it. But there's such a broad range of knapweed species, and they look different. They have different palatability levels, probably different nutritional content.
Sarah, the ones that Julie is typically dealing with is spotted and diffuse.
Okay.
In her environment, mostly spotted, but in other zones that are slightly more moist, it'll be spotted.
Yep.
Is anyone else dealing with knapweed that wants to drop theirs in the chat there? That also makes me think another thing worth thinking about is partnering with other producers so that you have, maybe you can borrow someone's sheep or cattle or whatever makes sense to bring in at different times for grazing whatever you're trying to deal with. And it's also can be really beneficial when you need to change your stocking density too, right? Like I know where I am, there's a time of year where I need to really get a lot of animals in there, but most of the year I don't need very many animals at all. And so it's nice to build those relationships so you have options to be able to change your stocking density and your species if possible.
Great. Julia, could you stop screen sharing?
Oh, I thought I had.
Yeah, I think there's something weird going on. I can't seem to stop you from
Yeah, I'm trying, like I checked and like it's only letting me share.
Oh, hang on one
Won't
second.
it let me?
Here we go. I've got you.
Did it stop?
Yep.
Okay.
You're going.
I wanted to highlight a couple of things that the three farmers just said. That was fabulous, by the way. Like that just was like such a great example of like how to manage the weeds with the livestock. Joseph's description of the high stock density grazing, and then how if he's doing mowing, he's doing it immediately when the animals come out of the field. That's how you avoid doing that overgrazing damage to the plants. Like if you wait for it to regrow a little bit and the seed heads are coming up and then you mow, that's when you damage the forage species that you want. So that mowing immediately as the animals come out is great. More moves, like more stock density, more labor, like we could really talk about that. It is so much more work to do that high stock density because you have to meet the animal's nutritional needs, so you have to move the fence. So some of the farms I'm working with are shifting over. So instead of like tumble wheels and bat latches and some of the simpler technology, some of the farms I'm working with are now using virtual fence so that they can make more moves per day without having to even walk out into the field and move the animals, where they're literally like using the app on their phone and moving the paddock over a little bit so that the animals are being moved with the virtual fence collars. Lots of other complexities with that, but it's really interesting to see how those farmers are able to use that new technology to change the plant species composition on their farms with just grazing management. And it even works on goats. One of the goat farms I work with actually says that he feels like the virtual fence collars works better than the really tall, very high voltage goat net fence that he was using previously. The sheep goat virtual fence folks are using mostly is the No Fence company that has the smaller collars. They're still working out glitches. It's early days. They don't have the collars that fit the lambs yet. So like if you've got a mixed flock, you'll have the collars on the ewes, but not on the lambs. And the lambs can get naughty as they age. It doesn't offer predator control the way the real electric fence around the outside is. So you've got to have a plan for that too. But that technology has real promise for building in some flexibility for vegetation management. And I did put some of the Fred Provenza links in the chat.
There's a bunch of really good links there.
More about that.
Yeah, Sarah put a few links up there in the chat, which you can scroll back to. I'll also save the chat and I'll send it to everybody. So there's some good discussions in there. Also, in a couple of places put in a link to a survey just from our funders. Before you leave, if you can just click on that and do the very quick survey, that would be fantastic. In the essence of time, I'm going to hand it over to Torrin, and then if people want to stay, we can discuss after his presentation. And there is a question in the chat that I kind of think Julia might be able to answer. I'm not going to put it out to the group just because we need to move on. So I'm not sure if you can or not, Julia, but maybe take a peek at that.
I'll take a look.
Thank you. Torrin Kelly is here from the BC Invasive Species Council, and he is the lead on special projects, and he's going to share a project that they've been involved with around targeted weed grazing with goats.
Yes, thank you so much.
No
And
worries.
thank you for having me. I often find myself a bit out of my depth in terms of where invasive species touch agriculture, forestry, fisheries. I'm kind of in and out of everywhere. So it always gets me excited to hear. Well, obviously I'm not excited everyone's dealing with invasive species because it's not a fun thing to deal with, but I do nerd out about it a fair bit. So thank you so much for having me. And I all know why you're here, and that's to look at these cute goats with bandanas around their necks. This is one of the goats that we had up during the trials there. But today I'm talking to you about a targeted goat, and that should say our browsing trials or grazing trials. My colleague from Spectrum, who was running the field work, is not here today, but I'll be talking to his side of it, and then the kind of statistical analysis side of it I will be speaking to as well. So jumping right in, we're going to set the stage of this research, how we did it, what it looked like, some discussion points, and where we think we can kind of move forward with this method of invasive species management or the trials themselves. So I have to say I was very jealous looking through the photos and seeing where they were working on these right-of-ways. And yeah, like just to give you some context, this is a bit out of what we've spoken to today, but I'm hoping that the results kind of show promise and will push people to use this as a method of invasive species management. But for the sake of this presentation, the research was done on a hydro right or a Fortis right-of-way and bridge right-of-way. And they were looking at alternative methods of invasive species management. It's really time consuming. It can be to deal with not only invasive species, but problematic species, tree species, lots of things. So they brought us onto this project to talk through how we could deal with invasive species in a browsing way. Infrastructure impacts, wildfire risk, safety hazards, access constraints. Not all of these are going to be totally relevant to all of you, but invasive species impact all of you, whether it's your animal's health, whether it's your crop yield, whatever it ends up being, invasive species are going to impact you. And all you need to know is that this hopefully will be a good measure of reducing the invasive species impact in your kind of small area. So I loved hearing Sarah talk about all the different methods. I always love to hear the toolbox talk. It's just a method, it's a tool in the toolbox. And a lot of the times we feel like we might be constrained to what tools we can use. There are people that use herbicides depending on the sites. We've heard a lot about biocontrols. That's a weevil for biocontrol. A lot of manual removal of invasive species, whether it's mowing, whether it's grazing, whether it's tilling, or just pulling it with our hands. We all love to do that. But there's lots of different ways, and we wanted to bring in this grazing as a potential management method for an integrated pest management plan. So bringing all these different methods together. So the group that helped us with the goat grazing was Conrad, Rocky Mountain Invasive Species Management, or Rocky Ridge Vegetation Control, based out of Alberta. Him and his 30 goats came up to our project site, helped us. Their role was to manage and supervise the targeted goat grazing, provide the animal care, herding logistics, on-site operations, and worked field crews to maintain the data quality on site. So this site we worked at is different in the context that we had to bring the goats to this site. there was a lot of things we had to deal with in terms of access. We needed to be able to house the goats. We needed to be able to feed, provide water. So there was a lot of considerations, and I'm hoping that barrier will be less so for the folks in this area where you might already have goats, or in a lot of cases, it seems like there's some more sheep farmers and other livestock that you can use. But this company was really great to work with. 20 years experience in Western Canada. They specialize in ecological vegetation management with goats, and they've worked on a number of pilot projects, including this one for reclamation and restoration work. So this is just a handful of those goats I was talking about in those very cute bandanas. So the reason we are doing this, what is our research question? It is targeted goat grazing a viable option for invasive species management on utility right-of-ways? And I'd like to kind of expand that out to the group here. And is it a viable option for invasive species management? So our site here was kind of halfway between Mackenzie and Chetwynd in northern BC. And we had two different site areas. We had a targeted goat grazing area, and we had our control area. We tried to keep those two as close as possible, so we can make some more statistical inferences that way. But we had to think of a lot of things, and I know that was a big bright flash for you there. Sorry, flash bang you on the screen. We had to think of a lot of things when we were picking our site. So several sites were viewed for selection along the Enbridge right-of-way. The site was selected south of Chetwynd that had access for livestock staging. So I kind of already mentioned that, but there were a lot of things you had to consider in terms of bringing the goats on, our field, crews accessibility, whether or not there were invasive species there, what invasive species were there, and how long it was going to take for people to get to and from the site were all huge considerations. Lastly, the way our research was designed, we needed to be able to lay out the control plot and the management plot in that four-cornered, and I'll talk about how that's done, but four corners centered, center to center. It was just a big rectangle, and we needed to be able to replicate that in the control and the treatment plots. So the total site area was about half a hectare on the right of way, and it included mixed kind of open terrain, flat, a little bit hilly, deciduous, coniferous trees, forbs, herbs. There was lots of different things in there. So it was a perfect site to see if this targeted goat grazing was going to be successful. So basically, we went onto the site. We found that area control site. We just GPSed off an area. Super simple, flagged it, took photos in at each area, at each corner. As for the research sites, basically what happened is once we did select our area, the field crews went out and made sure we had those GPS coordinates, took photos pre and post site management, and we were going to use those photos as well as the actual weight of the plants on the site to compare whether or not this treatment was statistically effective. So when the crews went out before the treatment, they picked 4 random plots. In those plots, they basically just cut all the vegetation down. They tried to separate invasives, natives, and further to that, shrubs, coniferous, dead or alive plant materials. Once they did that, they weighed it total wet weight biomass, and they recorded that. That was the first sample and first cutting of the research trial. After they collect this pre-treatment data, this pre-treatment biomass data, the goats were sent in. So 30 goats grazed the demonstration plot for around 7 days. The goats were herded to all corners of the demonstration plot to ensure all vegetation was covered. Livestock was monitored and controlled by staff on horses, dogs to ensure the goats stayed on the site. And the goats were housed in pens at night for water and protection from wildlife. So this process was fairly intensive, and I don't necessarily think it is required in a smaller context. So I don't want this to seem like it is out of scope, but For this site, we wanted to make the confounding variables as minimal as possible when we were trying to look at the results at the end of the day. So after the grazing happened, the field staff went out about a month later after the grazing to do the same measurements. So going in, selecting 5 random plots, cutting down all the vegetation, separating it out by invasive, native, type of plant, and then comparing those two biomass data sets post-treatment. Bit of a break there. So I know that was a lot of information, but I just wanted to set the stage of how the research ended up getting done. And this is not a super extensive research trial. We, like at the start of the presentation, this is in its 3rd year. And unfortunately, this year, we were not able to get the post-treatment data because the snow up in between Mackenzie and Chetwynd came a lot earlier than we thought it would. So we weren't able to harvest the post-treatment data. So hopefully this year coming, we're going to have the 4th year and have an even more significant impact. And I'm going to share the results here in a second, but just as a result of these smaller trials, there's always these confounding variables, and it was really discouraging to see that we couldn't get the consistency across those years. But I am happy to say that there was a statistically significant difference in biomass after these treatments. So that was really promising. But the overview of it is that there was statistical analysis was conducted to determine whether targeted goat grazing produced changes in vegetation biomass and species richness from treatment years. Goats, goats, goats. I have to get you guys. I know I'm going to talk about numbers, and I'm going to show you some goats, and then I'm going to talk about numbers, and I'm going to show you some goats.
Just to jump in quickly, we have
Yeah.
just 2 minutes until 3, but you can,
Yeah.
go. I'm sorry to have crunched you.
No. I will get these numbers out to you quick here. So we conducted 3 tests. I kind of already mentioned it. Pre and post browsing biomass, pre and post species richness, or those are the 2 important ones. So graphs is why you guys came here, and that's why I have graphs for you. Basically, all you need to know here is that with the question is there a change in biomass following this goat grazing? There was. There was a difference. It was a significant difference. There was a biomass reduction pre and post. And you might be thinking, yes, that makes sense. After a treatment of grazing, there would be a reduction of biomass. So we were expecting to see that, which is good. This is just the photos. So we want to emphasize that these photos are confirming what we've done in these tests. So we see that there is less biomass from August to October. The next question we wanted to know was the species diversity? So this was a targeted goat grazing. We wanted to know if there was a reduction in particular species from treatment, pre and post treatment. And there was no significant difference, but anecdotally in the data, there was a reduction of invasive species, not a non-significant reduction, but there was a reduction in the number of invasive species per plot pre and post. So I just want to share that we are starting to see, and hopefully it becomes a trend where it is starting to become more significant, where there's less of those invasive species specifically. The last one is, was there a difference in the amount of biomass year to year? So we were able to collect data for 2 years, minus this last year, and there was a significant difference in the amount of biomass pre-treatment grazing between 2023 and 2024. And what you're seeing on these graphs is there was 2 pounds. So there was almost, I'm terrible at percentages, but there was a significant difference in the amount of vegetation that was coming back after the treatment year after year. And we're hoping to see that kind of continue on. And I don't know how clear this photo is, but August 2023 to August 2024, some of that is trampling, but the overall vegetation and our field staff even said that there was visibly less regrowth in the same month the year after the first treatment. So, summary, browsing in 2024 reduced above ground biomass, which is great. The species diversity did not change significantly. We suggest the treatment primarily affected the quantity and not the community composition, which is another thing we can probably look into as a research trial. And comparing the 2023 and 2024 data, um, it is cautioned because the data was reprocessed. In the first year, we collected dead plant material, and then the second year, we didn't count the dead plant material, so there's a little bit of a compounding factor there. Sorry. And the last slide I will say is, it's always great that these trials are showing something good and showing something significant, but there is always some limitations to that. We would love to be able to make this site bigger. It was only half a hectare. We want to be able to kind of infer this at a larger scale. We'd love to have more plots. And the selective grazing by goats can have another kind of confounding variable to it because it could be uneven pressure across a site. And not all the time are you going to have 3 horses, 3 professionals, 4 dogs to move these goats around to exactly where you want them to be. So there is that case where this grazing could cause negative impacts where they're not grazing on invasives and they could be grazing on desirables. So just some things to think about. But the moral of the story here is that there is good news. There is a significantly reduced amount of biomass on these sites and mostly through invasive biomass. And I'm really hoping to have even better news for you guys next time I present on this in a year from now. But I know I probably talked over, so there isn't probably time for questions. But that's it for me.
Thank you, Tora. And my apologies. It's my
No,
time management skills of
all
keeping
good.
everyone on track is left us in this situation. I mean, people can stay and ask questions if they want, and if people need to leave, they can leave. But thank you so much. Does anyone have questions for Torin on the project or comments? And I'm just going to stop you from sharing here, and I'm going to put something on the screen. Awesome.
But Torin, is this going to continue this study? I'm like really curious to know, like what are the impacts from preventing these plants from going to seed or just from stressing and
Mhm.
opening up vegetation and allowing other plants to thrive? Like, what's your hypothesis and what do you think you would expect
Yeah.
to see going forward?
Yeah, no, great question, Julia. The plan is to do at least one more year of the trials, which is great. We have suggested to, as Enbridge is our funder for this project, so we've suggested to Enbridge that we include a IPM component to this, so integrated pest management. We want to be able to do these goat trials and supplement that with planting, supplement it with seeding, supplement it with manual removal, and see what methods work best with one another. And the other part of it is we would love to get it to a larger kind of scale of BC. Right now, it's very small. It's in a northern part of BC. I don't think it totally is totally irrelevant to everywhere in BC. I think goats, and we've seen it here today. I think targeted grazing works. Um, but there's so many things we could do, and I'm really excited that Enbridge is continually giving us opportunities. But to answer the question, I do think there is more to come. Yeah.